Bret Devereaux, thank you so much for taking the time to come back onto this podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
All right, first question. What is the Clausewitzian Trinity?
We're starting small here. I
We're
see.
starting small here, yes.
Yeah, no. So, fair warning for any of my readers who are now listening to this who play the Clausewitz drinking game. You are about to get absolutely hammered. For those who aren't familiar, the joke here is with military historians is that if you drank every time Clausewitz was quoted or cited at a military history conference, you could get very drunk indeed very quickly. Fortunately, I have water. Um, so we should back up. Karl von Clausewitz is a 19th century German military thinker. He fought in the Napoleonic Wars and after them was appointed to the head of the then Prussian Kriegsakademie or War College, one of the first institutions of its kind, intended to train not junior officers but senior officers. And in addition to running that, he decides to write essentially the big book about war, literally entitled Vom Krieg on War. And so his book, Vom Krieg on War, is intended as an almost a grand unified theory of war. He outlines the whole thing, has a few neat ideas, revises the first volume of what was intended to be a multi-book work, and then dies. And the whole thing is published posthumously by his wife. So it's worth noting that Clausewitz can be sometimes frustrating. The work is unfinished. Nevertheless, the first chunk, which is the part we're interested in here, is intact, is clear, and is one of the most important and influential works of military theory out there. You have to understand the Trinity, which I promise we're getting to, in the context of how Clausewitz understands war. And in particular is understanding that in an ideal form, war has as part of its character infinite escalation. That absent any other controls, each side escalates the amount of force, the amount of violence they're using infinitely. So if I bring 10 soldiers, your solution is to bring 100, and my solution is to bring 1,000, and yours is to bring 10,000. And then the winner would be the guy who has the most soldiers to bring. This sort of infinite escalation. That is how war functions in the ideal, as Clausewitz notes. But as Clausewitz is quick to caveat, the ideal never happens because the real world intervenes. No one can bring all of their force to one point. You might not necessarily want to use all of your soldiers in a given conflict. And there are all of these other factors. And the factors that restrain, in reality, the infinite escalation in the ideal, these factors are the Clausewitzian Trinity, which he lays out as friction, the political object, and will. Very briefly, friction is the tendency of things in war to go wrong, to be hard and complicated and difficult. You may have 100,000 soldiers, but it may just be very, very difficult to get them all to the decisive point at the right time. And so friction is just generally the tendency of things to go wrong. Of course, friction can be imposed upon you by an enemy, but it also just arises on its own. War is really complicated. Sometimes you're intending to hit an airbase, and you miss and hit a girls' school. Clausewitz's own quip is that in war everything is simple, but the simplest thing is very hard. This is the core of friction, the tendency for things to go wrong, as Clausewitz puts it, the play of probabilities and chance. So that's one thing that restrains your ability to escalate to your maximum notional force. The next is the political object, which is what you're trying to get out of war. States don't go to war because it's fun. They go to war to achieve things. And that's true even when we think about non-state actors, which I know we're going to get to. People don't use violence, most people, for no reason whatsoever. They use it to achieve things. There's something they're trying to get from the application of violence. And the amount of violence you're willing to apply, the costs you're willing to undergo, the damage you're willing to sustain is correlated to the thing you want to get out of something. So a state that finds itself in an existential war, a war in which if defeated they will be wholly destroyed, will deploy all of its strength Yeah, a state that finds itself in like a border skirmish where the outcome is significant but not determinative one way or the other is not going to be willing to apply all of its strength.
Yeah.
Right? The
So
political
like
object will control.
yeah, so like maybe like a state that like it feels like it's besieged on all sides and like they feel like they're fighting for their very survival. Maybe like a good analog would be like the Clone Wars during the Star Wars prequel era, where the Republic feels like their very existence is being threatened.
Right, and they pull out all the stops, and then by contrast, you can see the inverse if you hop forward to like the Andor series, and you can see that the Empire is very slow to escalate fully against the rebellion because they don't see it as a major threat initially. It's right. They give Partagaz the wonderful line about their healthcare providers, they're controlling disease, right? And it's only by the end of the series that they realize, oh no, we actually have a really significant problem, and we should have perhaps approached it differently and escalated earlier. By which point, it is too late.
Yeah, and like they don't even like the Empire doesn't even decide to make it like their biggest priority until after the event, like until around the time of the original Star Wars movie, both when the rebels steal the Death Star plans and when they blow up the Death Star.
Right. And so, but you can also see, right, a large state like the Empire has a lot of priorities. It has a lot of problems. Its fleets and armies and bureaucrats and administrators can't be everywhere. It has to apportion them. So small conflicts have to receive small amounts of resources. And this is what Clausewitz is going on about with the political object, that the means you apply to achieve a goal will be tailored to the importance and significance of that goal. Alternately, if I may stray into current politics, the reason the United States has not invaded Iran is not because it can't. It absolutely can, but because no goal that could be accomplished by invading such a large country would be worth the cost of invading such a large country. The United States has escalatory potential it is not using because it would not be worth it to use it.
Yeah, so
and that's
like,
a political calculation.
So how would you map? So two things. One is how would you map the Clausewitzian Trinity onto the war between the Rebel Alliance and the Empire in the original Star Wars trilogy? And how would you map the Clausewitzian Trinity onto what's happening right now with like the U.S.'s war against Iran?
Yeah, well, we still have one more element of the Trinity to consider, which is will. And this is an interesting addition into Clausewitz and a direct product of his experience in the Napoleonic Wars. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, European powers had largely taken popular sentiment out of the equation by maintaining well-paid professional armies that were relatively small. The French Revolution blows the system up. Revolutionary France and after it Napoleon were able to use popular sentiment and fervor to mobilize the whole of society, the levy en masse, and essentially bury Europe's professional armies under a tidal wave of Frenchmen. Clausewitz, it's interesting, in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the political leaders of Europe, Metternich and others, strive to put this genie of mass warfare back in the bottle. Clausewitz sees very clearly that it cannot be done. That escalatory potential, having been discovered, will be tapped again. And of course, he's right. It will happen in the World Wars, right? World War I is going to make Clausewitz a prophet. So popular will also controls escalation. The degree to which the public is invested in the conflict, if the public is very invested in the conflict, they will be willing to fight, willing to make sacrifices on the home front, willing to undergo anything in order to win. The classic example of this are the sort of total social mobilizations you see in World War II. Examples of publics that were extremely willing to make sacrifices for the war in the United States, in the Soviet Union, and so on. Just a complete mobilization of society. On the flip side, if the public is not very invested in the conflict, they will ratchet down your escalatory potential because they're not willing to undergo sacrifices, they're not willing to pay higher taxes or volunteer to fight. And so you are unable to draw on those elements of potential national force. The classic American example is something like Vietnam.
Yeah, or in like a more recent example might be Iraq.
Yes.
Yeah, or an even more recent example might be Iran.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. A different United States in a different mindset, like $90 a barrel oil, you might have people say, well, that's worth it to achieve the goal, so we're just going to knuckle down. Go and look back at World War II, propaganda and civil information in the United States encouraging people to take fewer trips, to not drive alone, right? The classic poster most people have probably seen of when you drive alone, you drive with Hitler, right? To all conserve oil because all the oil is needed for the warships and the tanks. So stop driving, stop riding the train, stop taking flights, carpool if necessary, sacrifice for the war effort. Right? There's no sense right now that if the administration asked for deep economic sacrifice from the American people for the war effort, that people would go for it. They would vote those guys out of office. And so the popular will is not there. So these three factors, the political object, popular will, and friction, are what constrain the ideal notional escalatory capacity that any state or non-state entity wielding violence has. And if you want to have the sort of like the Star Wars connection, right, popular will is clearly a huge factor. The Empire doesn't have it. The Empire doesn't have diehard supporters. And that limits the amount of force they're able to bring to bear, whereas by contrast, the rebellion does. And so they are able to continue to escalate and continue to build forces. And this element we're going to, I know, come back to, because when you are the weaker power in a contest, when you don't have the large army with the modern weaponry or Star Destroyers, you almost invariably end up focused on will as the component of the Trinity that you're trying to use to enable your escalation and to force de-escalation by your opponent until you can compel them to submit, until you can get them to give you what you want. And so will becomes the target in the Trinity for both insurgencies and also nonviolent protest movements, because they are unable to match the state in sheer violence potential, but they can potentially, through manipulating the aspect of will, prevent the state from deploying all of its violence and develop their own base of support.
So how are you defining insurgency versus nonviolent protest movements? Because it seems like what I'm getting right now is that what they both have in common is that they're not like, you're like, I might be an insurgent and I might be a nonviolent protest movement, but if I'm trying to use the will, like if I'm trying to basically take advantage of the the will or the lack thereof of the political body that I am fighting against, I'm not like the Rebel Alliance was trying to fight a protracted war against the Empire with the hope of trying to overthrow the Empire and replace it with the Republic. But what I'm getting from you is that insurgents and protest movements, they're not trying to overthrow the government, they're just trying to get the government to accede to their demands. Is that correct?
Sometimes they are trying to disestablish a government, though it's usually not. So, for instance, the insurgent campaign in Afghanistan was trying to disestablish the Afghan government the United States set up, but they were not trying to disestablish the U.S. government. I think you want to think in three categories. So, the first distinction we want to make is between movements that are attempting to build towards a conventional military confrontation and are not there yet. And these are our guerrillas. These guys are doing protracted war. And the Rebel Alliance, especially the Rebel Alliance in the core trilogy movies, is a great example of this. They have warships. They're building a fleet. They have starfighters. They can imagine a condition way down the line, and it comes in the third movie, where they face the Empire in a conventional military battle and win, and are thereby successful. But they are weaker than the Empire, so it must be a slow, long, protracted campaign, because if they try to face down the Empire all at once right at the beginning, they'll just lose. Then you have other groups that are even weaker than an insurgency would be, or rather than a protracted war guerrilla conflict would be. And so they conceive of no immediate hope of facing the state violence for violence, of engaging in a conventional battle in the field. And I term the sort of violent practitioners of this as insurgents, and then the non-violent practitioners as protesters. They do kind of exist on a spectrum, and they are using different means in a similar strategic framework. And in both cases, they're united by the fact that they do not expect to be able to ever overturn their primary opponent by sheer force. They're never going to have an army big enough. I draw in modern warfare, one of the ways you can tell when you're dealing with protracted war guerrillas versus insurgents or terrorists is ask yourself, do they have any plan to deal with armor and aircraft? Your guerrilla must. And if you look at something like North Vietnam during the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War, that was a protracted war movement. And they absolutely were shooting down U.S. warplanes. They had an active plan to get at the time, one of the most comprehensive and advanced air defense systems delivered from China and the Soviet Union, mostly Soviet, in the world. They were going to shoot down U.S. planes because their end goal was to be able to achieve victory on the battlefield, and you can't do that if you have no air presence at all. By contrast, the Taliban in Afghanistan never made any effort to shoot down any U.S. aircraft. The total combat losses of the war in Afghanistan of fixed-wing aircraft was a single A-10. We lost thousands of planes in Vietnam and won in Afghanistan because the Taliban's theory of victory did not require them to defeat the U.S. Air Force.
So maybe the difference between the Taliban and like the North Vietnamese is that like the Taliban, they were not trying to fight a protracted guerrilla war. They were just like, they were an insurgency, and the fact that they were an insurgency meant that the main part of the Clausewitzian trinity they were trying to manipulate was will. They were trying to get the U.S. to accede to a specific demand.
And specifically, they're trying to get the U.S. to leave, which would then enable them to execute a protracted war against the government of Afghanistan. A weaker foe that they could actually defeat.
Well, I'd hardly call it a protracted war. I'd call it a very brief war, but yes.
So the thing to understand is that if you're thinking about the collapse of the Afghan government after the U.S. withdrawal, you're only viewing the closing phases of that war. The Taliban effort to collapse the Afghan government goes back before the Doha Agreement, where the first Trump administration essentially doomed the Afghan government. Once it became clear that the Trump administration intended to get out, the Taliban shifted tactics. So the collapse was so swift because they had been waging the early phases, the non-positional phases of their protracted war for 4 years. And they had made that shift the moment it became clear that the United States was in the process of leaving, and they covered that shift because they had an agreement with the U.S. basically that if you tone down your combat operations on us because we want you to leave, we will tone down our actions against U.S. personnel.
U.S. personnel, yes.
Yes. They're continuing to assassinate Afghan personnel.
Including Afghans who ally with the U.S.
With the U.S. And that was the sort of part of the cynical part of the bargain, was that the Taliban was going to let the U.S. leave. They certainly didn't want to do spectacular attacks against U.S. personnel that might draw the United States back in for another 20 years. So that was part of the agreement in Doha that the Trump administration concluded. And obviously, if you're the Afghan National Army, that means your ally isn't really fighting your enemy, but your enemy is really fighting you. Obviously, you're going to lose, and they did. I think there's a popular perception that the Afghan National Army and the Afghan police forces just fell apart the moment that they were struck. They took tens of thousands of losses along the road to defeat. Afghan military losses against the Taliban are orders of magnitude larger than U.S. losses. They fought and bled and died, and then when the U.S. pulled their air support, they lost.
Okay, so we're talking a lot about the differences between like insurgency compared to protest, compared to even like protracted war. But like, how about let's try to simplify things for our audience by just like creating shorthands to like explain like larger concepts. Like, you know how in Star Wars the important factions of the galaxy are often given like very simple codifiers, like the Rebellion or the Republic or the Empire. Let's do something similar where, like, let's say the larger governmental body that's being resisted, let's just call it like the government or something. And like the insurgents or the protesters that are trying to use will to extract something from the government, how about let's call them like the dissenters or something?
Yeah, well, and then we do want to keep our protesters and our insurgents separate because they are operating with different tactics.
All right, so then let's just call them the protesters and the insurgents to not confuse our audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So we've got our protesters, we have our insurgents, and we have the state.
So what are the main differences between protesters and insurgents?
So the big question is the use of violence. So both the protesters and insurgents share a situation where the state has so much force, armies, police officers, and so on, that they can't just win a battle. They can't even fight a battle. It wouldn't even be close. But they still want to either, in some cases, overturn the state, more often give the state to change something it's doing. And so the question is, how? And the goal here is targeting will. The first step is to create a disruption. Protesters will do this with nonviolent disruptive protest. Insurgents will do this with violence, usually spectacular acts of violence like terrorism. This creates costs for the state. And the idea is if you inflict enough trouble, eventually the people who support the state will decide to give you what you want to make you stop. Now, there's immediate complexity here, especially when you're using violent means. The challenge that the insurgents face with terrorist tactics is that they have to use those tactics because the target is will. You know, they do not expect, and I want to stress this, they do not expect to defeat the armies of the state with car bombs. They do not have enough car bombs. That's why they're doing this. If they had enough car bombs, they would be fighting differently. They do not expect to defeat the armies of the state through their acts of violence. The acts of violence are pure messaging. As the Marxists would tell you, propaganda of the deed. Pure propaganda of the deed. These are messaging. The tricky bit is that the terrorist needs to send different messages to different groups. And most terrorist groups, in addition to being morally repugnant, screw this part up because it's very hard. On the one hand, the terrorist needs to communicate to the state and to the people that support it that they will keep exacting costs until their demands are met, so it's just easier to give me what I want. They also need to communicate to potential supporters that they are actively achieving the goal of the movement. Because one of the things insurgents face is that the state, with its superior force, will inflict disproportionate casualties on them. The state is going to kill more insurgents than the insurgents kill of the state's police or armies, or even usually of their civilians. So the messaging is required to produce a steady stream of recruits into the meat grinder that is this approach, because you're going to keep losing them. So you need more people coming into the organization than you're losing off the back end as you continue to create the disruption. And the goal then is to make the disruption perpetual and self-sustaining so that the state can never fully stamp you out. And so the only way to make it stop is to give you some sort of compromise, is to give you what you want. The danger is in the sort of flip side of will. Your spectacular attacks, often aimed at civilians, may have the unexpected effect, and we've certainly seen this demonstrated, of instead convincing the local population that your terrorist movement is so evil that it must be opposed by any means necessary. And you can end up increasing the escalatory potential of the state. And so the terrorist or insurgent has a needle to thread here. And you can see on the one hand, if you want a historical example of successfully threading the needle, look at Ireland's march to independence, often through violence, a successful threading of that needle. On the flip side, if you want to see this done badly, ISIS. messed this up multiple times, perhaps most famously in the run-up to the so-called Anbar Awakening, where their spectacular violence in Anbar province caused most of the local sheikhs and community leaders to turn against them. And those guys, with their both militias and significant local knowledge, meant that they could point out to coalition forces in Iraq, like, those guys are the terrorists. ISIS suddenly becomes spectacularly visible to U.S. and coalition forces and suffers a massive defeat that they only recover from during the Syrian civil war, where they then reveal themselves, alienate everybody through spectacular violence, and then get leveled again by the overwhelming power of the state here, the United States, again. So that's the sort of the failure to thread the needle. It's worth noting, we tend to think more about successful insurgencies than about failures, but the failures are more common, by far more common. We just don't think about them very much because you don't hear about them. It's so unusual for these movements to succeed that it draws our attention when they do. But I think Max Boot figures that 80 to 90% of all insurgencies fail. Most of these movements fail. It is really hard because they are so weak. Remember that, like, guerrilla warfare, protracted war, is already a strategy of the weak. The terrorist is even weaker than that. So of course they usually lose. Not a surprise there. But this threading the needle, where the spectacular violence of the terrorist must be spectacular enough to garner recruits, but also not alienate local populations, but also extract costs from the state, that kind of inside straight of violence, the challenge of that, I think, explains why nonviolence can, in the right circumstances, be more successful, because it squares the circle of that dilemma.
Would you characterize nonviolence as a moral stance, a pragmatic strategy, or both?
Yes.
Yes.
It is both. It is very clearly both. Nonviolent movements, if you read the writing of leaders of nonviolent movements, they are both cognizant of their need to communicate nonviolence as a moral position, although please, 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 as Clausewitz tells us, war is an extension of politics by other means. The communications of men like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi are strategic. They may not represent those people's innermost thoughts. They are intended for your consumption. You are the target. They're very valuable, don't get me wrong, but they're strategic. These guys are communicating strategically and with intent, because they have to in order to achieve their aims. But they're very cognizant that one of the elements of that strategic positioning is to present nonviolence as a moral stance. It is also presented as a pragmatic stance. I really encourage people, if they've never read the whole thing, read the whole letter from a Birmingham jail. Not just the parts that get excerpted. It's not very long. Read the whole thing. Martin Luther King Jr. walks through his strategy in Birmingham. And he's very clear that nonviolence is a strategy that he is employing to achieve a result. He works through how he expects to achieve the result, how he has timed his nonviolent demonstrations specifically to disrupt the local shopping season in order to put pressure on local businesses, which will be the means by which he pressures local politicians. He's explicit about how he has negotiation channels with these individuals, because after all, he can't win unless they have a way to surrender. Right? He needs them to have a way to give him what he wants. There is a strategic framework. It is practical. It is intentional. So it is both a moral stance and a practical method, and it needs to be treated as both at the same time. Fundamentally, what nonviolence is doing as a practical strategy is squaring the terrorist circle. It is resolving their dilemma by avoiding the spectacular violence in the first place, or more correctly, by having the state, which they oppose, supply the violence for them. You still need a spectacular moment of violence in order to draw public attention, decrease will for the enemy. But if you supply the violence, you may alienate the public. What if you could bait the state into supplying the violence?
So like nonviolence is intended. So like the insurgencies are often intended to provoke a reaction from the state, but nonviolence is also intended to provoke an overreaction from the
To
state.
provoke an overreaction from the state. That is the purpose. That is the aim. And nonviolence works best when this reaction from the state itself demonstrates the illegitimacy of the state.
So like, is the Gorman massacre from Andor an example of how nonviolence provokes an overreaction from the state?
And yes, and notably, Luthen's character points it out, right? Andor is like, if you do this, Gorman will burn, and Luthen is like, it will burn very brightly. He's explicit that he's like, yeah, these guys in their nonviolent demonstrations are going to be very sympathetic, and they're going to provoke a catastrophic overreaction from the state, and that catastrophic overreaction is going to strengthen our cause and our movement. And he's absolutely right. The Empire creates more rebels than they shot in that sort of situation. You can actually, in a real-world example, you can see this play out in real time in 1960 in the Nashville campaign. This is desegregating the lunch counters in the department stores in Nashville.
The sit-ins.
The sit-ins, exactly. And one of the things that's really striking about this campaign, so I should note, nonviolence requires a lot of discipline. It requires a lot of training. Those sit-ins were almost 2 years in preparation before they happened. There was careful training. The locations were scouted. The sort of leading cadres were organized. They were trained. Of course, they were trained not to fight back, because it's really hard to just take a beating and get arrested and not be confrontational throughout the whole thing. But if you look at the structure, right, the initial sit-ins are disruptive, not because the folks sitting at tables are disruptive, but because local whites would be disruptive in response. So the sit-ins bait an over-response from the sort of forces of segregation. As that response builds, they know full well the police will side with the white supremacists and assist in beating up the guys doing the sit-ins, in beating up the protesters. But they're banking on essentially that Nashville can't arrest all of them. And it's worth noting that Nashville tries. There, I think, like when violence finally breaks out, there's something like 80 arrests on the first day, 150 arrests over the first week. The Nashville police, what they do is they back off, they let the white racists beat the hell out of the protesters, and then they arrest the protesters for causing a fight, even though the protesters have thrown no punches, done no violence. That was their strategy. But the national attention that drew, because, you know, remember, the Nashville sit-ins, they're not trying to win a fight with the police. They can't. But the attention it draws allows the movement to recruit new students for sit-ins faster than they're being arrested. So the sit-ins don't stop. They can't stop. Every time the Nashville police arrest one group, the next group is already there, ready to take their spot. You can arrest them, there will be another group. You can arrest them, there will be another group. And the overall impact of will is such that it is simply not possible to arrest all of them. Each arrest creates more than one new protester. And so the protest never ends, and so the disruption never ends. And so the only way, if you're the department store, the only way to actually sell food at your lunch counter is to give these people what they want. Which is why the campaign is eventually successful. And so that interaction, right, and because it's nonviolent, you avoid the possibility that you end up accidentally alienating the public, that you overshoot, because all the violence is being provided by the state.
Nonviolence really does seem like it requires just like an insane amount of discipline.
Remarkable amount of discipline. One thing that comes out really clearly if you spend any time at all studying the civil rights movement or the independence movement in India is that it required a tremendous amount of training and discipline. These things had to be prepared and they had to be planned. It is really hard to get groups of people to let the state do violence on them and not do violence back. It's a very effective strategy in the right circumstances, but it's really hard to pull off.
Yeah. So like maybe then like are there cases where nonviolence was tried and failed where like maybe the example that comes to my head would be how the like Duchess Satine, the leader of Mandalore during the Clone Wars, is an example of a committed practitioner of nonviolent philosophy and probably one of the most nonviolent political leaders in all of Star Wars. But like she ultimately fails and is killed. Can you think of like tons and tons of examples in the real world where nonviolence was tried and failed, and what were the structural factors that led to them failing?
So certainly there are examples in the real world, and I think we can divide them broadly into two groups. The first group, which is ironically, I feel like less common as a failure state, though it certainly seems like the cleverer way to combat a nonviolent movement, is if the state simply refuses to play its part. And the classic example of this in the civil rights movement is Albany, Georgia police chief Lori Pritchett in 1961 and 1962, who is effectively able to diffuse a campaign, a civil rights campaign, because he simply refuses to play the role of the brutish segregationist jerk. And so he is arresting protesters, but he is not making it spectacular. He isn't having them beat up. He isn't creating headlines. And as a result, the Albany campaign sputters.
So like he's responding to nonviolence with more nonviolence?
In a sense. I mean, he is arresting them. That is a form of violence. But he's carefully controlling the amount of violence he deploys in order to avoid being baited into the overreaction that the nonviolent protester needs in order to draw public attention. Of course, the great contrast with Lori Pritchett is something like Birmingham Commissioner of Public Safety Bull Connor, who blunders into every trap set for him because he was a violent, brutish, authoritarian individual, and so it was trivially easy for the civil rights movement in Birmingham to provoke sounds like the wrong word because they're doing things that should be legal, but to do things that would cause him to overreact, and of course to famously overreact with fire hoses and attack dogs on camera. And it's striking, I will note, that the Jim Crow South, a system of violent repression, unsurprisingly created a lot more Bull Connors than Lori Pritchett's. Right? The very nature of the system encouraged it to create the kind of leaders who would not be able to successfully cope with nonviolent approaches. You can say the same thing about British civil government in India, is that it produced the kind of men who were exactly the kind of people Gandhi needed to succeed, right? That who would overreact, who would do the wrong thing in response to him, who wouldn't de-escalate. So that's one failure state for nonviolence, is if you get a Lori Pritchett who can de-escalate against you. But again, the very systems that tend to be vulnerable to nonviolent protest in this way tend to be authoritarian, anti-democratic systems, because with a democratic system, you can just vote. And those sorts of authoritarian systems tend to produce and recruit violent bigots who are not going to be able to de-escalate. I would say that we saw this also play out earlier this year in Minneapolis, right? That the very nature of the ICE and CBP raids into Minneapolis meant that the guys running them, the Gregory Bovinos, were Bull Connors.
Like the ICE officers.
Yeah, from the top to the bottom. And so they kept doing damaging things on camera because that's the kind of person who signs up to work for ICE.
So how violent or non-violent would you say that the protests against ICE were in Minneapolis earlier this year?
I would say that they were nonviolent in principle. I mean, I know that there were altercations, but nobody car bombed an ICE officer. We live in a country with more guns than people. Nobody opened fire on an ICE patrol from a rooftop. That is what a guerrilla campaign would have looked like. That is what a terroristic insurgency would have looked like. No, the ICE protests were an extremely successful application of nonviolence, and it worked. public opinion shifted, and all the leaders of the Minneapolis raid got fired. It was successful. I should note, because I don't want to leave it hanging, the other way that nonviolence can fail is if nonviolence finds itself facing a state that really is just willing to kill the requisite number of people. And we see this play out, for instance, at the opening of the Syrian civil war, where it turns out, like the initial nonviolent protest, Assad is simply willing to bomb those people. Likewise, we've seen that play out now multiple times in Iran, where mass civil risings against Iran's government have simply been put down by spectacular violence. For the state to be able to do that, it isn't enough that the leader is willing to implement that kind of violence. They need goons. They need a lot of goons. They need a lot of guys with guns who are willing to open fire onto crowds. And producing that kind of security apparatus takes time, and it's quite intentional. So a lot of states simply aren't capable. This sounds very weird, because obviously we should never wish a state to be capable of just murdering its own people, but a lot of states aren't capable of doing this. And in fact, and this goes into a sort of separate topic of what's called coup-proofing, which is how these authoritarian regimes protect themselves from overthrow. Most of the things that a state does to make itself better at suppressing internal dissent through violence makes it worse at, like, economic productivity or waging war. Iran should not be a poor, weak country, but it is, because it is coup-proofed. The reason that the Iranian government was able to put down the demonstrations last year by killing, I think the last estimate was at least 12,000 people, is the same reason that despite being twice the size of Texas and having 90 million people, Iran finds it difficult to project regional influence, despite being just much larger than all of its neighbors and having a ton of oil. Those are connected. The things that make you good at murdering all of the protesters make you bad at everything else.
Like, being bad at everything else, does that increase the chance that people will have a desire to rebel against you if you're not providing for them economically?
It can. And so you have this sort of chasm between relatively stable democracies on one end, who avoid violent insurgencies because political tensions are worked out through nonviolent means via protest and election. And so those systems are mostly stable. I know the United States doesn't feel really stable right now, but we're going on 250 years of a single form of government, and that is fantastically stable by international standards. So that's really stable over here. And then on the other end, you have really stable autocracies. You have metastasized prison states like North Korea.
Does China count as a stable autocracy?
I think so. And of course, the Chinese government demonstrated in Tiananmen Square in, was it 89, that they were perfectly willing to murder the requisite number of people in order to enforce their rule. Now, on the flip side, you'll note that China also struggles a lot with internal corruption, in part because so much power is centered in unaccountable dudes wielding lots of violence, and they tend to steal everything. And while China's economy is huge, relative to its size, it's actually a middling performer. It's a middle-income country, not a high-income country. And its growth has slowed significantly because it's really hard to be a high-income country and be coup-proofed. Those push against each other because high-income countries tend to have fragmented, dispersed power, where there are lots of actors in the political system with little bits of political power, and coup-proofing is all about concentrating violence and power. And so I think you do see these elements in China. China is simply, it's so big of a country with so many people and so many resources that I think there's a potential to miss the trade-offs that are being made. Although I feel like they're perhaps starkly visible in the course that Hong Kong has taken, converting from one end of the spectrum to the other after rejoining with China and becoming a much less economically and culturally vibrant place in the process. That you kind of see this. I mean, that said, it's not an accident that proponents of autocratic regimes regularly point to China as the example of a highly successful autocratic regime. As prison states go, it is probably the best one around.
Yeah, and I guess maybe then the question is like, do you think that between like when it comes to different forms of dissent, like there's insurgency and there's protest, do you think that like democracies are an example of the type of country where it makes more sense to protest, and autocracies are the type of like country where it makes more sense to engage in insurgency?
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to be the case. It is possible for weak autocracies to collapse in the face of mass protest movements. These are your classic color revolutions. They work. The key is that the mass protest movement gets so large that the guys who wield guns for the state decide not to stop it. They get out of the way. And when that happens, the state collapses. And coup-proofing is all about directing a lot of attention at making sure the guys with the guns won't do that. There's a reason that Iran, for instance, has two armies. There is the actual army of Iran, and then there's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. And the IRGC is what enforces regime loyalty. And it is not the army of the state of Iran. It is the army of, essentially, the leadership party of Iran, the private army of the leaders. That army within an army is actually really common in autocratic states that are coup-proofed. It's a really terrible way to run a military. Like, it's not good at winning wars. You can actually see this playing out right now, where Iran would really like to make a deal, but getting the actual Iranian military and the IRGC on the same page with the Iranian government is really tricky. And so you'll get, like, the diplomats are like, we've made a breakthrough, and, like, the IRGC just hurled a missile into the side of a tanker. Bit of a whoopsies. And this can be a real problem. But those sort of parallel systems are pretty common in these kinds of coup-proofed militaries. And so, yeah, against a coup-proofed autocracy, your only option is insurgency, and you're probably only going to succeed if you can get an outside military power to back you.
Like,
that's what you really need.
This is kind of like the Onderon example in the Clone Wars, where the Republic backs a bunch of insurgents, where those insurgents have the goal of trying to get the Separatists to withdraw from their planet without actually engaging in protracted war.
Right. And because foreign backing makes a world of difference for all of this. Foreign backing is worse than useless for non-violent movements because it tends to discredit them. For violent movements, it's essential. It provides bases where you can hide, where the state that you're trying to overturn can't strike you, and foreign actors can provide you with the tools of modern military activity. And they can do so in contexts where the state you're trying to overthrow may not be able to neutralize that production, right? If you take, for instance, the Vietnam War, right? Vietnam was employing sophisticated anti-aircraft systems against U.S. air power. Normally, the United States would want to bomb the factories producing the missiles that were shooting down our planes, but we couldn't because those factories were in Russia. They were not in North Vietnam. They were not available to be bombed. And so for violent movements, foreign support is extremely valuable. For nonviolent movements, financing helps, but for the most part, these tend to be indigenous and domestic. It's honestly, it's kind of funny that the autocrats, Putin does this a lot, are constantly imagining like the secret webs of CIA influence behind pro-democracy movements in like Eastern Europe. And it's not there, and it wouldn't be useful if it was. The CIA isn't actually very good at that. They tend to mess it up. The pro-democracy movements in places like Ukraine or Georgia are indigenous.
Yeah. So we've been talking quite a bit about like insurgency and protest and how those are like different forms of dissent against the government to get the government to accede to certain demands. I am curious whether over the past several decades, insurgent movements and protest movements have become easier because of the explosion of new unique technology like smartphones or the internet. So how has modern media technology amplified the effectiveness of insurgencies compared to protest movements?
So because both insurgencies and protest movements are fundamentally targeting will, And so because victory and defeat is decided in the mind rather than on the battlefield, they are extremely sensitive to media technology. Modern terrorism, as it emerged in really the 80s and 90s, is almost chiefly a product of modern broadcast media, particularly television. The sort of like the Osama bin Laden school of terrorism is all about creating TV-friendly acts of violence, because that broadcast was necessary. And you can imagine if all you're getting is newspaper reports, the spectacular nature of the spectacular violence would not be as effective. Likewise, the civil rights movement was powered by television, very much so. To move more to more modern, right, mass communications enabled these nonviolent color revolutions across the sort of former Soviet bloc. Because people could communicate and coordinate much more rapidly, movements that might normally, right, it took decades for the Poles to build solidarity. But Euromaidan came together in weeks. Because the communications technology enabled much faster communication and therefore much more rapid, the fancy term is preference cascade. Equally, it's important for getting their message out. And you see this with the Minneapolis nonviolent protest, that social media was essential. The advice for the Minneapolis anti-ICE protesters was film everything. Everybody have a phone at all times, and then anytime a DHS officer behaved badly, which was often, as we've discussed, for reasons, it was immediately like filmed, clipped on YouTube. The whole nation could see it. And that rapidity created an information environment that was even more rapid than the sort of TV environment that was successfully utilized by the civil rights movement. And it enabled an extremely rapid shifting of public opinion. The Minneapolis ICE raid, chevauché, whatever we want to call it, managed to fail in just a few months. Whereas it took the civil rights movement years, in some cases decades, to achieve similar results. Because the rapidity of communication. Now, of course, on the flip side, the state has access to this communication and technological potential too. Social media provides a tool for the state to communicate its message. They don't always do a great job of it. It also provides opportunities for surveillance and control. Technological control is a key part of coup-proofing in the People's Republic of China, for instance. The censorship of information, the tracking of individuals, facial recognition systems, and so on, as a way to sort of keep protest movements small and to enable the state to crack down sharply when they feel that they want to. And so, you know, I think there's a danger in assuming that technology always cuts one way. It doesn't. Technology doesn't always favor the state. It doesn't always favor those opposing the state. But specifically because protests and insurgent movements are so much about messaging, new communications technology fundamentally changes the battlefield for those movements, and movements that successfully leverage that new technology are the ones that tend to succeed.
Maybe this is a case where, like, within democratic states, like mass media, like modern media communications technology tends to be a plus for the protesters, whereas in autocratic states, it tends to be a plus for the state because of, like, disinformation campaigns.
That is certainly the bet that both the Iranian regime and Xi Jinping are making. Right? Note that the moment the major protests started in Iran, the Iranians had put a kill switch on their internet. They just turned it off. The Iranian internet has been functionally non-existent now for, I think, 6 to 8 months. I don't know the exact timing. They just flipped the internet off in order to prevent the protesters from coordinating, and in order to prevent images and information about their crackdown from getting out to the broader world. In order to avoid Tiananmen Square-style live videos of IRGC soldiers opening fire into crowds. Now, some of that stuff is still leaked out anyway, and so we know it happened. But you'll recall when the crackdown came, there were days where the Western media was like, we know a crackdown is happening, We have very little information about it because they turned the phone and the internet's off. Because the state had built in a mechanism to do that. Most countries do not have the ability to flip their internet off at a switch. Likewise, I've already mentioned, right? China has invested very heavily into online communications and technology controls. And so these are autocratic states that are betting that they can install enough controls to turn the power of technology in their favor.
Yeah. That does make me kind of curious. So if we were to think of like the whole Francis Fukuyama end of history thing about how democracy is like all roads lead to democracy, maybe we're in like a kind of like road of divergence where countries that have successfully become democratic have the potential to become more democratic, and countries that have like managed to become autocratic have the potential to become even more autocratic or authoritarian.
Yeah, and of course the thing that's cross-cutting this is the economic impacts of those different forms. And so I was talking earlier that you seem to have stable democracies on one side and these stable coup-proofed autocracies on the other side, and a chasm of chaos between them. And sort of countries trying to scramble out of the chasm on either side. Whether that's right, like Ukraine is attempting to scramble out of the chasm into the stability and prosperity of the EU, and then you see other autocracies trying to build Chinese-style coup-proofed regimes scrambling out of the chasm to stability on the other side. But there's an economic implication here too, that generally speaking, the countries on the democratic side of the chasm tend to either already be or rapidly become high-income countries. The countries on the autocratic side of the spectrum tend to be low or at best middle-income countries. And the countries caught in the chasm of instability tend to be the poorest countries around. And so, I think Fukuyama would look at this and say, look, vindication. The model that works is liberal democracy. The autocratic model might be stable in some places, but it fails to deliver for the people. And it produces states that in the long run will be weaker powers. Again, momentarily distorted by the fact that China has an awful lot of people, but look by contrast at the absolute embarrassment of the Russian autocracy as compared to significantly smaller and more resource-poor European democracies. Right? Germany is without a doubt has more economic and diplomatic power, more heft than Russia, despite not having any oil and having fewer people in it. Because it's a liberal democracy with an advanced economy and Russia isn't. And so Germany can financially maintain the Ukrainian war effort forever at no real significant cost to their economy. Meanwhile, Russia is inflating its currency, burning away a generation of its young men, and the Germans can just write checks and then go back to their beer gardens. Right? That difference in power. So on the one hand, the Russian autocracy seems internally stable while Putin lives. Interesting to see if it's stable after that. But on the other hand, it grossly underperforms in military power, in economic power, in diplomatic heft. And even, I realize it's weird to say because China is this rising power, and it's very big and very powerful, but given its size and its scale, China's own ability to power project is remarkably unimpressive. Militarily, China can't project power across the Taiwan Strait. It'd be the equivalent of the United States not being able to project meaningful power to Puerto Rico.
And economically, it's not doing as well as like a comparable democracy with the same population.
And it doesn't have the cultural heft you would expect of a country of its wealth or population either. We are finally getting international Chinese blockbusters. They are happening. But they're not many. They are outnumbered by British or American international blockbusters. Like, can you imagine, given the comparative size and economies of these countries, that the cultural engine of 1.5 billion people in China is outperformed by the cultural engine of, 60 million Brits?
That does make me feel a little bit better about like how people are talking about how there's a lot of democratic backsliding, especially countries that have historically been some of the most democratic in the world, like the US. So then I do want to know what this says about like
Fukuyama predicted this, I will note.
Sort of.
That if there's nothing to struggle for, people will struggle for the struggle. He's like, one of the problems you will face at the end of history is that in the absence of a real ideological challenge to liberal democracy, people will revolt against liberal democracy out of nothing but boredom.
I don't think that the people who are revolting against democracy, I don't think they would characterize their own motivations that way.
No, I'm sure they wouldn't. I'm sure they would also claim that they have a real ideological challenge to liberal democracy, but I have suffered through reading Curtis Yarvin, and no, they don't.
Okay, so like, let's take the example of the authoritarian that is currently occupying the space of the presidency. You see, like we would agree, Trump is an executive who's been using his presidential power to do like illegal stuff, like dismantle institutions without congressional approval. Like, where
but ideologically, what is Trumpism?
Yeah, I don't know, but like him doing illegal stuff to benefit himself, does this fit into your framework anywhere? And also, like, if this is an example of like him going against a lot of the norms and a lot of the trends that you're supposed to use the state for, is it Trump working within the state or against the state when he uses the presidency to illegally benefit himself?
I mean, he's using the state, having obtained power within the state. I mean, I think what you understand all of the Democratic backsliders to be doing is to attempt to push their country across that chasm I described, because it would be better for the authoritarians individually, even though it would be worse for the country at large. What is striking is that none of them have yet succeeded. Many of them seem to get quite close. They are all trying really hard. Obviously, Viktor Orban just failed, right? The oldest and perhaps most advanced of these sort of democratic backsliding efforts in Poland also to sort of make a more autocratic Poland have run into real problems, to sort of say the least. And looking at the Trump authoritarian project in the United States, one doesn't get the impression that they're headed towards success. They can't hold Minneapolis. And obviously, the political environment for Trump and his party right now looks very bad. Right? I mean, depending on which aggregator you look at, Trump's approval ratings are at something like -20. And it's hard to consolidate an authoritarian state out of a democracy when no one likes you.
Yeah, okay, that...
Right. It's worth noting that when Viktor Orban was successful, he was popular. Right? When Viktor Orban was rewriting the Constitution, he was also winning majorities in elections. Now, he gerrymandered the elections so that his We majority made a huge majority in the Hungarian parliament. But he was able to be popular. And it's interesting that in less consolidated democracies, figures like this, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, Narendra Modi in India, seem more able to sustain their popularity long term and thereby sustain their governing coalitions than in more consolidated democracies. But it's one of these things where on the one hand, we see a lot of this democratic backsliding, but the historian in me kind of feels like it's too early to say what the long-term implication of that backsliding will be if any of these fellows is actually going to set up a durable autocratic regime. And one of the things my mind jumps to here, because I'm a classicist, is that, of course, in ancient Greece, they had their version of democratic backsliding too, and this was tyranny. That whether an oligarchic state or a democratic state, one of the perils that they understood for a Greek city-state, a polis, was the rise of a demagogic tyrant, right? Tyrannos, the original use of the word, one-man rule. And one of the things that's really striking about Greek tyranny, it was a common feature of the incredibly unstable politics of Greek polis, which were much less stable than modern liberal democracies, for the most part. But one of the things that's interesting to note about these Greek tyrants is that it seems to have been the aim of a great many Greek tyrants to convert their position of power into something like hereditary kingship, to make it durable and permanent and lasting. And what's worth noting is that they all fail. Every last one of them without exception. No Greek tyrant ever manages to make himself something like a king. The longest running Greek tyrannies make it out to the third generation before collapsing. Most collapse the moment the guy's son takes over, because the son doesn't have the juice and it all comes apart.
I guess maybe the worry is that like there were times in ancient Greece where when those tyrannies fell apart, because that person, like that individual leader, was gone, it ended up having very negative spillover effects on the rest of Greek society.
Oh yeah. I would strongly suspect not doing tyranny if given a choice. I would suggest sticking with democracy and not electing a strongman. But I just want to stress that I think there's a tendency to assume that this sort of strongman rule is durable and stable because that's a thing the strongmen themselves want to say about it. But that doesn't actually appear broadly true. And it's worth noting for the sort of this modern Orban style model of authoritarian politician within a democracy that we've seen. We've seen it fail in Hungary. We've seen it fail in Brazil. We've seen it fail in South Korea. It is on the rocks in Poland. It does not look like it's headed towards success in the United States. And now we can see other countries that appear ready to run the experiment. Maybe Nigel Farage will be the next prime minister in Great Britain. He seems to be a fellow of this same mold. But it sure seems like these populist, authoritarian, demagogic coalitions are actually really hard to keep together. And they tend to be less stable. Now, that could still create a situation where the politics of the future are endless cycling between liberal democracy on one side and demagogic tyranny on the other, which would be on the net really bad for everybody. But it certainly doesn't seem like the authoritarians are winning.
Okay.
It's just we might be losing.
Yeah, but like if it's like a lose-lose situation, that's still bad.
That is still bad. Yes, I would agree.
All right, so then paint three pictures for me. Let's just take let's take the future of American democracy as an isolated example. Within like the next 5 to 10 years, paint the picture of what the worst case scenario would look like, what the most plausible scenario would look like, and what the best case scenario would look like. And what advice do you have to people who want to undo democratic backsliding? What advice do you have to those people to make sure that we can get incrementally closer to the best case scenario rather than the worst case scenario?
So the worst case scenario is civil war. The most likely scenario is muddling through. Always. The most likely scenario is muddling through. So the worst case scenario is that it all breaks out into mass violence. A renewed civil war in the United States would not look like 1861. It would look like the Syrian civil war at 10 times the scale.
Maybe 100, but yeah.
Yeah, it'd be bad. That would be truly horrific. I don't actually think that that's likely because it doesn't seem to me that MAGA actually has the base of support to do it. Right. I mean, this is the problem that like it's probably a bad idea to launch a civil war when you're underwater by 20 in the polls. You're probably not going to, right? Because what's going to happen is you will have just lost an election and then you will decide to fight about it.
Well, do you remember that quote from the Bene Gesserit in Dune? An animal caught in a trap will gnaw off the own leg to escape.
Well, and that's the risk, is that somebody does something stupid. And that's why the potential remains. Because I just think it's pretty clear. I don't think MAGA wins a civil war. Not the least of which because, right, remember in civil wars, suddenly international support becomes really relevant. And what are the relevant sources of international support? It's Canada and Mexico. Which side are they on, Chief? It's not the MAGA side. So, but it would be so incredibly disruptive and destructive and bloody. It is the worst case scenario to be avoided. I think the most likely scenario, as like I said, is muddling through. It looks like the Democrats are going to win some elections. So Trump is probably out of office in 2029. But you could see a scenario where the Republican Party remains quite Trumpist with different leaders, and the Democrats try some reforms and some accountability, but it doesn't really go anywhere, and we continue this cycling between a kind of Trumpist MAGA Republican Party and a kind of almost Bidenish Democratic Party. Essentially, the roller coaster we've been on since 2016 continues in a kind of muddled and annoying way. And, there's some precedent for that. You can see that kind of oscillation in the politics of the 1880s and the 1890s, which culminates in the emergence of the progressive era in American politics. So the fever does tend to break eventually when one party eventually comes up with a durable answer to the political problems of the moment. But the period of muddling is going to be pretty unpleasant. I think your sort of optimal outcome... The example that my mind always goes to is what Athens did in the aftermath of the overthrow of the 30 tyrants. The 30, for those who aren't familiar, this was the oligarchic occupation government put in charge of Athens after Athens lost the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. While it was put in place by the Spartans, it very much derived its power from a real and existing anti-democratic bloc within Athens. And the 30 were quite brutal. And as a result of, we talk about this sort of trap of the state employing too much violence and creating its own reaction. The 30 tried to kill their way through the democracy. They created the reaction. They were out of power in under a year. And then the Athenians are like, what do we do? The 30 tyrants killed several thousand citizens. These states aren't very large. That's a lot of people. Almost anyone living in Athens had collaborated in some way with the 30. And so there's a question of what do we do? And the solution the Athenians came to was that the 30 tyrants themselves would be exiled and killed if they were dumb enough to stay in Athens. This is a quirk of Greek law. If you were sentenced to capital punishment, you could usually just leave and they would let you go.
Oh, so you're just like excommunicated.
Yeah, exactly. They just need to get the hell out. And some of the chief lieutenants of the 30 also, basically the ringleaders, faced full and unmitigated accountability. And since they had murdered people, that meant capital trials if they stayed in Athens. So they all left. But then a general amnesty was declared for everyone below the ringleaders. And instead, the Athenians constructed a kind of national myth that apart from the ringleaders that had left, everyone in their hearts had supported the democracy, even if they had had to pretend otherwise. And it was a sort of, you'll pretend you didn't support this, and we'll pretend we believe you solution to knitting together the state in the aftermath of that. And it worked. The Athenian democracy restabilizes, and it stays stable after that for decades and decades and decades until it's eventually uprooted by outside conquerors rather than by internal destabilization. And so the model I would encourage the Democrats to think with, after January 6th, the Biden administration did essentially accountability for the little guys and not the guys on top. They were very slow to go after the leaders of the Trump administration and very quick to go after the dudes that broke windows on the Capitol. What I would encourage a future Democratic administration to think of is the reverse. Accountability for the ringleaders, but not so much for their supporters. For their supporters, you offer reconciliation. You will pretend you never supported this. We will pretend we believe you. But for the ringleaders that you can show, it has to be clear, that you can show did crimes. One of the advantages that the Athenian Democrats had in the immediate aftermath of the 30 and in their quest for accountability is that they could say we are for the law. We're going to put these people on trial for the crimes they did. We're not just retaliating. We're letting the justice system do what it's supposed to do. I think the Democrats would be wise to take the same approach. accountability for those at the top for the illegal things they've done. I don't think that will be hard because a lot of the people at the top are doing illegal things in broad daylight on the assumption that they will not be held accountable. And then something like an amnesty below. What, of course, makes that really hard is the Supreme Court and pardon power, which presumably this administration, when it is outgoing, will attempt to use to shield itself from accountability. Although I would sometimes caution. I often see the sort of lawyerly folks who are like, well, here are the 11 legal reasons why it would be really hard to achieve accountability. And you know, there's a line you sometimes hear that in significantly extreme situations, you stop being biology and start being physics. In sufficiently extreme situations, your political system stops being law and starts being history. And so, you know, people debate the legality of presidential self-pardons. And as a historian, what I will tell you is that the legality of presidential self-pardons is almost wholly determined by Donald Trump's approval rating when he leaves office.
Because there's nothing in the Constitution that says the president...
There's nothing in the Constitution that says it. And also, if Donald Trump leaves office in a flurry of self-destructive violence and, you know, he's voted out by Ronald Reagan margins, then Congress has all sorts of exciting means up to and including amendments to just nullify his pardons. They could declare that as an insurrectionist he was never president in the first place and dare the Supreme Court to stop them if there's enough public support behind it. Do I think there will be that kind of a wave? No, I don't. I don't think that the flow will be that extreme. But that's sort of what I mean by you reach a point where your politics stops being law and starts being history. There are levels of public outrage where the pardons don't matter. And accountability becomes more possible. But like I said, I think the most likely thing here is muddling through, and the big unknowable question is whether Donald Trump's movement can survive him. One way or another, this guy is not going to be president in 2029. And if no one else is capable of knitting together his movement, then politics will reconfigure in his absence in a way that may enable a kind of breakout from that muddling cycle that we've been stuck in now for 10 years. And it is striking that there really isn't a clear heir. There isn't a clear person who can pick up where Trump left off. And it also seems really important that Trump is very old and obviously in ill health. So unlike other autocratic leaders, it doesn't seem likely that he will remain the active, energetic center of the movement, whether in office or out of it, much beyond 2028.
Bret Devereaux, thank you so much for taking the time to come back onto this podcast.
Thanks for having me.